Good Yontif. Like the Israelites of old, we arrive at the Yizkor service of Shavuot to gather the harvest of memory, picking up, as it were, the fallen sheaves of our loved ones, laying them on the threshing floor of our hearts. The sanctuary setting, the call of tradition, the memorial prayers, the means by which we summon the souls of those ever present in our lives. This morning, I would like to frame Yizkor by way of Shavuot's most recognizable book and persona, Ruth, whose story we read earlier this morning. I want to revisit a familiar question. Why do we read Ruth on Shavuot? A question whose answer, or at least an answer, provides insight not just into Ruth and Shavuot and the connection between the two, but also our task at hand at Yizkor. Why do we read Ruth on Shavuot? Well, as with all Jewish questions, the first answer is because the rabbis said so. Esther on Purim, Song of Songs on Passover, Lamentations on Tisha B'Av, Ecclesiastes on Sukkot, each of the 5 scrolls, Megillot, are paired with a festival, and Ruth is today's festival. Why connect Ruth with Shavuot and not another holiday? Because our pilgrimage holidays, the Shalosh Regalim, Sukkot, Passover, and Shavuot, were all originally connected to Israel's agricultural cycle. The backdrop of the Ruth story is a barley harvest, an organic, thematic, and seasonal connection. And if that were all there was to mix my holidays, dayenu, that would be enough. But there's more. The prayer book refers to Shavuot as Man Matan Toratenu, the time of the giving of our Torah, when the Israelites stood at the base of Mount Sinai to enter the covenant, receive the law, and thereby become a people. The mystics suggest that present at that day on Sinai were the souls not just of the newly emancipated Israelites, but those souls not yet born and not yet converted to Judaism. Ruth, a woman of Moabite origin, is perhaps the most famous of all converts to the faith. Wherever you go, I will go. Wherever you lodge, I will lodge. Your people shall be my people, your God, my God. It is by way of Ruth's open-hearted and full-throated declaration of loyalty to Naomi, her mother-in-law, that Ruth becomes an exemplar of entering the covenant, an affirmation to be championed on this day given over to our bond with God. Ruth is about Ruth. Ruth is about Naomi. Ruth is about a lot of people. But next time you're in Jerusalem and you walk down Ruth Street in the Emek Rephaim neighborhood, read the street sign closely, and you'll realize that for many, Ruth's claim to fame is being Sabato Shel David HaMelech, grandmother of King David. According to tradition, King David was born and died on Shavuot. Why do we read Ruth on Shavuot? Because it connects Ruth to David, Sinai to Zion, and Ruth's redemption, theologically speaking, to the final redemption. Ruth, as noted, is a Moabite who, by way of her first marriage to Naomi's son Machlon, and then her second to Boaz, binds her destiny to that of the Jewish people. But Ruth wasn't just any foreigner. Ruth was a Moabite. Her pedigree was tied to Israel's historic enemies, a people with whom the book of Deuteronomy explicitly prohibits from marrying. As such, the reader is forced to square the circle of Ruth's inclusive message with the exclusionary stance of the rest of the Bible, an exercise which many point as exactly the argument. Ruth as a counter-narrative in a Bible otherwise reluctant in its embrace of non-Israelites, be it the time of Mount Sinai, the time of Ruth, or our own time. Ruth offers a big tent message. If Ruth, the Moabite, can convert to the faith, then perhaps we can be a little more welcoming to that non-Jewish girl your son just came home from college with. Who knows? She might just be the grandmother to the next King David. Why do we read Ruth on Shavuot? Because Ruth reminds us that be it Mount Sinai or today, the Jewish people were and will always be constituted by a mixed multitude. Why do we read Ruth on Shavuot? There are more reasons than there are days of the Omer. I've only offered a few. This morning, by way of an insight of an ancient rabbi and contemporary teacher of mine, I want to offer one more especially suited for Yizkor. In the Midrash on Ruth, Rabbi Zera openly asks the question of why Ruth was written in the first place, never minded included in the biblical canon. It contains no laws of purity or impurity and makes no mention of that which is permitted or prohibited. What business does this pastoral tale have in a Bible otherwise filled with laws, obligations, and commandments? Rabbi Zera answers his question explaining, "Lalamdecha kama sachar tov legomlei chasidim." It is to teach you the reward for those who perform acts of hesed, a Hebrew word which I will leave untranslated for the moment. Rabbi Zera's terse comment needs to be unpacked, a project undertaken masterfully by my late doctoral advisor, Tikva Frimmer-Kensky, in her posthumously published commentary on the book of Ruth. Tikva identifies how chesed, in word and deed, is woven in to the fabric of the narrative. We begin with the story's open, when Ruth, who is widowed as a young woman and under no obligation to care for her mother-in-law Naomi, makes the unexpected choice to accompany Naomi back to Beit Lechem. The same quality of chesed, we could say, applies to Naomi, who extends beyond the call of duty to bring her widowed Moabite daughter-in-law back to her hometown. In chapter 2, having heard of Ruth's first act of chesed, Boaz extends chesed to Ruth, allowing her, a foreign woman, to glean in his field, going the extra mile, instructing his staff not only not to hassle Ruth, but to leave extra sheaves for her to gather. Hearing of Boaz's chesed, Naomi responds in chapter 3 by coaching Ruth as to how to endear herself to Boaz. One can only imagine the cross-currents of Naomi's emotions in engineering the courtship of her deceased son's widow. Without going into all the details, we learn that Boaz is under no legal obligation to redeem Ruth, the narrator sharing that there is another kinsman with a more immediate claim. Boaz responds yet again with chesed, releasing that individual from his obligation so as to take it on for himself and marry Ruth. Our story closes with a final act of chesed, this one performed by Ruth and the community. Ruth bears a son, but our parting image is that of Naomi holding him and the community announcing a son has been born to Naomi. This is not a typo. This is chesed. What greater act of chesed can there be towards Naomi than to grant her, having lost her two sons, the redemptive joy of becoming a grandmother? Frimmer-Kensky thus traces a narrative in the spirit of Rabbi Zera, identifying chesed as the thread tying the story of Ruth together. And here we turn to the word that I've yet to translate, chesed. Most often understood as kindness, chesed is a multifaceted, hard-to-translate word, carrying with it connotations of benevolence, loyalty, mercy, grace, and love. It was a great sage, Maimonides, who, in his Guide to the Perplexed, offers a definition of chesed that I think goes directly to the heart of Ruth. Chesed, he says, is the act of extending kindness to those to whom we owe nothing, towards someone who has no claim on our time, our resources, or our very self. Call it altruism, call it unmerited generosity. Hesed is an act of kindness born not of obligation or expectation, nor driven by kinship or reciprocity. It is the deed we do that exists beyond the letter of the law. And here we arrive at Shavuot. Shavuot is a festival about the binding authority of the law, receiving the Torah, the obligations that stem from it, the commandments we understand and those that we don't, the mechanisms of enforcement, reward for the law's fulfillment, and penalties for its breach. Shavuot is all about din, about the letter of the law. And Ruth, our counter-narrative, is about going beyond the letter of the law. In Hebrew, lifni mishurat hadin. None of the characters in Ruth are biologically related. They are relations in love, not in law. Kin by deed, not by blood. Ruth is about what happens when folk act not out of obligation, but out of chesed, a reminder that law is only part of the story. Chesed is the other, the pillar upon which the world stands. An important rejoinder to this festival of law we're celebrating today, but really every day. As Rabbi Yochanan taught in the Talmud, Jerusalem was destroyed not for the breach of the law, but because the Jews of that generation judged solely according to the law and not beyond it. It's the ingredient that sustains the story of Ruth and all of our stories, the ties of chesed that bind us one to another. And all of this, I believe, brings us back to Yizkor. We arrive here to recall our loved ones, fathers and mothers, husbands and wives, brothers and sisters, sons and daughters. For many here today, the relations are biological or entered into by way of covenantal commitment. So too many here are remembering loved ones who were friends, community members, leaders and teachers, mentors and guides, without whom we would not be here, we would not be who we are. As Rabbi Harold Kushner of blessed memory once wrote, family are the people who show up. And whether the loved ones you are recalling at this moment are or are not formally kin, as the floodgates of memory open, I'm willing to venture it's not the legal relationships that are occupying this sanctuary and our hearts. It is the acts of chesed, those quiet conversations when a parent dropped their guard and let you glimpse into their humanity. The way a mother's touch scratched your back just a moment longer than needed, long enough to make you feel safe. The handwritten note signaling unspoken pride. The steady presence of a spouse who held your burdens without ever calling them heavy. The sibling who saw you not as you saw yourself, but for the person you were becoming or had the potential to become. The friend whose presence made you feel less alone in this world. The mentor who went the extra mile, spent the extra time to nurture the spark that's uniquely yours. These are the memories that surface at Yizkor, not the obligatory acts, but the gestures of the heart, not law, but chesed, the deeds that endure forever, that have made us who we are and bind us forever to those we have lost. Why do we read Ruth on Shavuot as we recite Yizkor? We do so to focus our attention on the things worthy of being remembered, and by extension, the deeds by which we will be remembered by others into the future. As the psalmist reminds us, Olam chesed yibaneh, it's by way of chesed that the world will be sustained. Ruth to Naomi, Naomi to Ruth, Boaz to Ruth, Ruth to Boaz, and so on and so forth. Hesed is the quality holding the characters and the book of Ruth together. A story that opens with death and closes with life, that begins with the bitter and ends with the sweet. A grief-stricken people who, despite bristling at the divine decree, honor the legacy of their loved ones by extending it forward into the future. It's a story of Ruth. It's a story of us, the promise, the comfort, and the blessing of this moment, the hesed of Yizkor. Thank you for joining the Park Avenue Synagogue family. I hope you enjoyed the sermon. Please consider supporting our online community by scanning the QR code or by going to supportpas.org or by making a donation. Shalom and see you in shul.